cooker and I made it into a mash tun. A mash tun is where you cook the grains. I put a little spigot there on the side, and it holds about 6.5 gallons. I do a brew in the bag system. That's the bag hanging off of the side of it. Okay, the grain is in the bag is in the basket is being lowered into the pot with hot water. I raise the bag up and down to make sure all the grain is wet and comes into contact with the water, and the water will then leach the starches out of the grain, the sugars, and it becomes wort. It's just wort. Using a spoon, every once in a while I will stir everything up just to make sure that all the grain comes in contact with the water. As I'm taking the grains out, I like to get every last drop of my wort from the grains. So I let it hang there and just drip for a while. After the grains have been removed from the wort, it's time to fire this thing up and get it boiling. Here in this pic, you see it's approaching what's called a hot break. That's when proteins rise and they start ganging up together and at this point it can really boil over on you, so you kind of want to really keep an eye on it. Then during the boil, which will be for an hour, hour and a half, during preset given times, you'll be adding to that hops as called for in the recipe. Some hops will add it 15 minutes before the end of boil, some 30, some 45, some 60. It just all depends on the recipe of the beer that you're making. Once you finish your boil, you got to get that 212 degree wort down to about 70 degrees to pitch your yeast. So what I do is I put this copper coil, which water flows through to cool the wort down. Also, at this point, sanitation is uber critical. From now on, through the pitching of the yeast into the wort, it must be hospital operating clean. As I mentioned earlier, during the cool down process, you try to rapidly get the temperature of the wort, this is 5 gallons, down from 212 degrees down to 70 degrees where yeast can live and grow and multiply. So right now we have a problem. We have an air temperature of 83 degrees, and I'll use a fan to blow on the kettle to help it out somewhat, because to 212 down to 83 is a huge drop. So the fan on the outside metal, really helps. Now the water we're going to run into it, we have a groundwater temperature of 78 degrees. It's Texas. They don't lay the pipes too deep. So what's going to happen is that's not going to, really be effective. So after the wort comes down to, in the 80s or whatever, then the other copper coil that's outside, I'll put it in a bucket and fill it up with ice. Then that will chill the water going into the coil in the wort and bring it on down. And this usually takes about 45 minutes to an hour. Which is a long time, but that's the best I can do with what I got. Brewing in the wintertime is much easier when you got 50 degree air, 60 degree air. We finished the process now. The beer, no, not beer, it's wort. Wort is poured into a fermenter, and because the wort is now cooled down, and we add the yeast to it and put it in the fermenter, and in about 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the recipe, you'll have beer. It's the yeast that turns the wort into beer. The yeast eat the sugars and expel carbon dioxide and alcohol. They're lovely little creatures. Yeast does the same thing when you're making bread. Now this is a hydrometer. The hydrometer gives you the specific gravity, and as maybe you can see on here, it's 1.075. That's a pretty high gravity beer. Then the next thing that you do, on the top of the fermenter, you put a little bubbler, and that allows the excess CO2 to escape, but does not allow oxygen to enter the beer. And we have come out right on the money with 5 gallons, which is really cool.